This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A conversation about grain sorghum planting considerations with Lucas Haag, agronomist in charge at Tribune, and Logan Simon, K-State Extension agronomist, begins today's show. Justin Waggoner, K-State Extension beef cattle specialist, keeps the show rolling as he talks about why early weaning could be an option for cattle producers' drought management plan. Ending the show is K-State Extension horticulture expert Matt McKernan, as he recommends those with conifers start scouting for early signs of bagworms on trees and shrubs. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show discussing grain sorghum planting in Kansas with agronomist in charge in Tribune, Lucas Haag, and K-State Extension agronomist Logan Simon. Lucas, Logan, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
You bet, Shelby.
Thanks for having us on.
As we're thinking about grain sorghum planting in Kansas, what are some key considerations for growers to keep in mind?
Well, so one of the things, making sure, we're aware of soil temperatures. We've made a lot of strides in recent years on the cold emergence of sorghum, but still want to make sure we've got some optimal temperatures there, and being aware of, obviously if we're under something that's got really heavy, wheat stubble versus something that's a low residue situation, those are going to be vastly different in terms of how soon we're ready to put sorghum in.
Yeah, I think some other scenarios that we've got out here as we're thinking about getting into sorghum planting. Tied in with that planting date, we also have factors like hybrid maturity, and ties in with our planting date as well as things like our seeding rates and its relationship then to row spacing. So a lot of factors.
And what range do we see when it comes to planting dates across Kansas?
Yeah, so grain sorghum probably has the widest range of planting dates of our major crops here in Kansas. We generally split the state up into 4 zones. For folks that have seen our maps and other publications, it's that standard where we separate out the Northwest through the Southwest into Central and North Central and Northeast, South Central to East Central, and then finally the Southeast. When we think about the Southeast, we break that up into two zones. We got kind of that earlier window of May 1 to May 15th, which has passed in that area. But then also another window in June 5th to June 25th in that area, kind of separating that out, driven largely by getting that flowering window on either side of the peak heat there in Southeast Kansas. Zone 3, again, that's South Central to East Central, looking at May 15th to June 20th. And similar for that Southwest to Northeast Kansas. We narrow that up into our region that has the shortest window to get that sorghum in from planting to harvest in the Northwest, where our general recommended window is May 15th to June 10th. However, as Lucas stated, and may have more to share on this, we really use these as a starting point, and then we drive our decision-making based on actual observations of soil temperature as well as soil moisture in some cases for those of us who are hoping to get some moisture in the ground to get some good stands when we go to plant milo.
And what observations are you currently seeing when we're thinking about getting grain sorghum put in the ground?
Well, one of our biggest challenges, in the western part of the state, and actually in some, we got a few areas even in central that haven't caught range yet, is simply just having moisture to plant into. And so, and the thing is we've got, as Logan mentioned, we've got a fair bit of window yet to be successful with grain sorghum. At some point, if we were having this conversation another 2 weeks from now, we'd be starting to get concerned, in far northwest, far west central Kansas, because that window does start to close in terms of having enough heat units to actually finish the crop. And so at some point, we'd start thinking about adjusting hybrid maturities. We would, think about adjusting seeding rates a bit. But that really is a big challenge right now is just getting some moisture to plant into. And of course, sorghum being, smaller seeded than a lot, than corn, for example, having that firm, moist seed bed's even more important to make sure we get, soil around that seed coat so we get, good imbibing of water and germination.
In addition to these considerations around moisture and maturity by first killing frost in the fall, we also have some other factors that often can drive decision making. And I really want to think at this point about some of our insect pests that we sometimes tailor our planting dates around, and pests that have become problems in the past. So the first one, of course, is the sorghum aphid. What we call sorghum aphid now would be the sugarcane aphid. And when we think about managing around those aphids, we think about planting earlier in those earlier windows, trying to get that crop further along to avoid that aphid. We also, another pest that we've been fighting that would fit that same description would be the sorghum midge, which has been a problem in parts of western Kansas, causing injury and the resulting in empty heads. On the flip side, however, that early planting can be a problem and was a problem these last few years in central Kansas when it came to chinch bugs. This year, I think, is going to be pretty different because a lot of our chinch bug infestations, when we get them really severe, that has to do with early planted sorghum near wheat fields. And as those wheat fields are maturing, you get that movement of those chinch bugs over into sorghum. This year, with as early as the wheat crop is and the conditions that we have right now for planting sorghum, I think that we're going to see enough of a separation to hopefully avoid some of those really severe infestations we've seen, again, in parts of central Kansas these last few years. But again, important pests that we also consider when we think about planting dates.
And how might someone need to adjust their hybrid if they're depending on when they get it planted?
Well, so there's a couple pieces of that. So one, matching the hybrid maturity to the length of season we have left. The other key piece I'd throw in here, and I think this is really important to some years in Kansas, is if we find ourselves in a later planting situation, very much like we've talked over the years with wheat, late planted, we got to increase that seeding rate, so we're going to set fewer productive tillers. And sorghum's very much the same way. We're counting on productive tillers to be able to meet that yield potential. And so as we find ourselves, as planting dates move later and later, we're going to have fewer productive tillers out there, so we need to be thinking about adjusting that seeding rate upward in order to compensate for that.
How much might you adjust it upward?
Oh, that really depends on where you're starting from. I think if we're in a situation where at an optimal timing, it's not out of the realm to think maybe if you think about from an optimal timing to be in, say, by the time you're in that mid-June time frame, we probably need to be increasing by 20% or so.
And thinking about making adjustments, are there any big differences between maybe wide or narrow row spacing for grain sorghum?
Yeah, I don't know that we've got, unfortunately, a lot of data that would really drive that, seeding rate based on row spacing. There's been a lot of different thoughts on that over the years. Here 10, 15 years ago, when there was kind of this resurgence and interest of drilling sorghum, there was this idea of we needed higher seeding rates. Now, part of that was, we were compensating for the fact that our drills typically don't do as good a job as what a planter does. We weren't getting, the same percentage emergence. But really, for a lot of our good no-till drills today, that's not as big of a concern as it was, a generation ago with that equipment. So again, I think it really goes back to matching that seeding rate for your planting date and for your yield potential, your yield environment.
So as we look forward and hoping producers and growers get this crop well into the ground, what's the ideal weather conditions you would want to hopefully have the most successful crop possible?
I mean, there's optimal and then there's what's going to happen, because it's one of those things where, I really relate to this on the cotton acres because, for example, Shelby, and across the state, we've had really good soil temperatures, especially through southern Kansas. We've had perfect soil temperatures for crops that need a little higher soil temperature, like sorghum or cotton. Unfortunately, the big drawback is moisture. And until we get some moisture in the ground and have a good moist firm seed bed to plant into, many of us will continue to wait as we march our way through our window for sorghum planting, which is fortunately a lot wider than cotton planting. So we don't feel quite the squeeze of the cotton growers.
Yeah, I mean, I just say in general, and actually sorghum and cotton have some similarities in this regard. Is I mean, we need heat and water to drive yield, and so that's as long as we can get even measures of heat and water through the season. I would go back though, and maybe I think too often about things in terms of water, but when we visit with producers about irrigating sorghum, especially under short water, we think about there's really three key timings in the year we want to minimize stress. And so in rough terms, we talk about if you only had 3 inches of water to put on, you'd put it on at 30 days, 60 days, and 90 days. Well, and what that really means is, growing point differentiation, roughly 30 days after planting when we're setting maximum kernel number, and then boot, and then grain fill. Those are really the three key time periods in the sorghum development cycle that we want to minimize growing conditions.
Lucas, Logan, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
Thanks for having us on.
That was K-State agronomist in charge in Tribune, Lucas Haag, and K-State extension agronomist, Logan Simon. If you'd like to read more on this topic, there are 2 Agronomy e-update articles. The first one is titled Sorghum Planting Considerations, Planting Date and Hybrid Maturity. The second one is titled Sorghum Planting Considerations, Seeding Rate and Row Spacing. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing drought management factors when it comes to beef cattle with K-State Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner. Justin, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
Justin, as part of our state is in drought, what is something they might want to consider as a management plan for their cattle?
Yeah, so I think with any situation, especially drought, or producers experiencing that right now, it's really important to have a plan and to both a grazing plan, but also a management plan. And I think that's where early weaning really becomes a part of that conversation, is that management part of the plan. It's one of the things we can do that can have an impact on cow requirements. It can also get us some additional grazing days back that can be utilized to sustain those cows a bit longer on those pastures. So it's a great management tool from that aspect. And so recently, some questions kind of came in regarding early weaning. So I thought that'd make kind of a good topic for us to talk about here today. And one of those questions was, well, how early can I wean a calf, right? If we're experiencing drought, we've got some spring calves. Really, what does that look like? And so what we do know is that we can actually wean a calf that's been raised, I'll call it, in a kind of a conventional environment. So we think about just native type grass setting, native grass pastures. That calf will actually have a functional rumen at approximately 45 days of age. So we can wean those calves relatively early if we have to. They certainly have all the capacity to be able to utilize dry feeds at that point. However, from an early weaning perspective, what we've seen with research is the optimum time to wean those calves is really 100 to 120 days of age. So anything greater than 100 days of age, I think is really a good benchmark for weaning, for early weaning calves. And so if we think about conventional weaning programs, would be somewhere between 180 to 220 days of age typically on those calves. I would consider early weaning to be really anything earlier than that, so less than 200 days of age, if you will. And really that optimum appears to be somewhere between that 100 and 120 days for the best outcomes on both the calves as well as performance on down the road in the feed yard.
Are there requirements needed for those calves if the producers are choosing early weaning?
Sure. So one of the things with an early weaning program that I think goes hand in hand with, a successful program is having a nutrition program and a plan for those calves that are going to be early weaned. And so nutrition is a big part of that. So as you kind of think about Those calves that come in, a lot of times they're going to be somewhere between 300 and 400 pounds. Dry matter intake at that point on those early weaned calves is somewhere around 1% of body weight. And so if you do the math on that, that's only about 3 to maybe 5 pounds of dry feed per day. So those calves don't actually eat a lot of feed. And so that creates one of the challenges for us, that whatever we do feed them has to be relatively nutrient dense because their requirements are relatively high. And so that's really one of the challenges that we run into, is that the feedstuffs that those calves are probably going to be most familiar with, think about a high quality grass hay. Well, it's not necessarily nutrient dense, and even if they were able to eat the 3 to 5 pounds per head per day of that dry hay, that's not going to meet their nutrient requirements and maximize their growth potential. And so that's where we have to have a good nutrition program to go along with that, to couple that with that early weaning program. So having a plan for those calves and accounting for the fact that their intake is going to be relatively low. So oftentimes that's going to involve some sort of ration, maybe that's a starter pellet, something in addition to those, high quality hays that we might feed those calves. So having a management plan there. There's also, one of the things that we need to touch on is, why might a producer do early weaning? I think that's always kind of a big part of the strategy. And so one of the things with early weaning is it's really a management tool to save condition on those cows. And so once we early wean that calf, we can actually reduce that cow's energy requirements by 25 to 30%. So the cow's energy requirements, because she's no longer lactating, reduces those and reduces her nutrient demands, which allows her to increase her body condition score on those limited resources. In addition to that, by removing that calf, we can actually get a few more additional grazing days back on the cow. So we're essentially the forage that the calf was consuming, that can now be consumed by the cow. And so for every 4 days that we wean that calf, that we do not have a calf aside, we actually get 1 grazing day worth of forage back on the cow. So if we think about drought as being really a game of days and how long we can stay on a given unit of pasture, we can certainly increase the number of days that we can maintain those cows on that grass.
You mentioned the nutritional needs for a calf when they get pulled for early weaning. Are there other things within a pen space that producers should consider to hopefully give the calves their best chance?
Sure. So there's a variety of things, and those would all be very similar to what we do in terms of a normal weaning pen setup, right? So some things to consider would be access to the water tank. Very simple things. Does that calf, they're going to be smaller than the standard calf. Can they actually reach the water tank? What's the height of the bunk? Do we have sufficient bunk space? If we fix any of those holes, making sure that those calves can actually get up and consume that feed as well. So really prepping that weaning pen. Some cases, if we have very large weaning pens, we may want to add additional panels to those just to keep those calves a little closer to that and reduce that pen space. So a lot of the normal things that we would do associated with weaning calves, but we're just going to have a little bit smaller animal. So I think sometimes that access to the water trough as well as access to the feed bunks may be something to take into consideration.
And flipping back to talking about the cows and this drought management plan, if producers are early weaning their calves to hopefully maybe get a little more condition on their cows, does that make a difference for breed back?
Sure. So as we think about kind of downstream implications, especially with younger females and higher price females, if we allow that cow to pick up some additional body condition score by weaning that calf early, her requirements are fairly low. So that gives that cow that opportunity to build some condition back on. And so the thought being there is that those cows will carry that condition forward through the winter, calve in a better body condition score. And so that should set us up for better reproductive rates in that subsequent breeding season down the road. So we see that benefit, but it is a bit longer term trajectory there in terms of seeing that benefit in terms of breed up in those cows.
If producers do have a drought management plan and early weaning is part of that, is there anything they need to shift or maybe factor in differently each year?
Well, I think one of the things to take into account is, early weaning is a great management tool. So if, you would normally wean in October, okay, just weaning 30 days earlier might be another strategy. So that is one of the tools that we can have some flexibility in terms of that managing tool and being able to manage those cows' nutrient requirements. Not that we always have to wean at 100 days of age with an early weaning program. We might be able to do that just about 30 days earlier some years. In other years, we may want to do that at an earlier point in time if conditions are drier and we need to maybe take some additional pressure off of that pasture and give those cows an opportunity to gain some body condition score back. What's really critical, I think, is monitoring cow condition as well as pasture conditions.
That was K-State Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner. If you'd like to find out more information from K-State's beef extension team, you can do so by checking out their website, which is ksubeef.org. I will also link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rod Bain and National Agricultural Statistics Services Lance Honig, as they discuss how growers will soon provide their input of USDA surveys making up several June reports.
Producers over the next few weeks will be surveyed by USDA, with their answers making up the data within several June-issued reports, including
the acreage report. That is the report that tells us how many acres of the various crops producers actually planted for this upcoming season. But also we've got grain stocks and rice stocks reports being released.
Lance Honig of the National Agricultural Statistics Service says those reports will be issued on June 30th. He discusses the significance of the surveys in connection with the June acreage report.
It will be survey-based, and so when we talk about acreage, we're well aware that farmers will certify their acres with FSA, and in a couple of months, when those data become available, that will be a key component of what NASS uses to estimate acreage. But in June, those data don't exist yet. Certification has not taken place. Geospatial information also valuable for measuring acreage, but not in June, because the crops have not emerged to the point where satellites can identify those crops. And so at this point in the year, it is very survey driven.
In addition to the surveys making up data for the June acreage, Ag Quarterly Grain and Rice Stocks reports,
4 times throughout the year, we capture inventory levels for hogs across the country. June is one of those. And so first couple of weeks of June, we'll be reaching out to those producers and asking them to report their inventories on hand, information about their pig crop, information about their farrowing intentions, things of that nature, so that we can provide an update on June 25th about exactly what's happening with the hog industry.
Producers can respond to the June agricultural surveys online at agcounts, all one word, .usda.gov, by phone or by mail.
As we look at these acreage estimates that NASS publishes in the acreage report at the end of June, historically, you can go back and see, at least for the major crops, corn, soybeans, winter wheat in particular, those estimates typically are within about 1% of where actual acreage comes in. And so very accurate numbers coming out of the acreage survey. We would expect this year would be no different.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. Southern Kansas is seeing bagworm caterpillars emerging from eggs and young caterpillars actively feeding on plants. At this point, K-State Extension horticulture expert Matt McKernan is recommending those with evergreens begin monitoring. Matt, in terms of bagworms, this is maybe a little bit earlier than normal to start talking about bagworms.
It is. Typically, we expect bagworms in Kansas to hatch anywhere from mid-May to early June, and usually over a several-week period. However, this year, with the really warm temperatures that we experienced in March and April, a lot of people around the state, and especially in south-central Kansas, have been noticing bagworm populations since really the middle of April. And while bagworms are still small, their damage is minimal, but we know the more they eat, the bigger they get, and the bigger they get, the more they need to eat, which has people concerned about whether or not they need to treat those bagworms earlier in the season this year.
I think you're kind of touching on it, but really at this point what we need to be thinking about is just monitoring for bagworms?
Yes, just because you may have had some bagworms hatch early doesn't mean all of the bagworms would have hatched early. So we could probably still expect some bagworms to hatch around the mid-May to early June timeframe. But because there may be some that have already hatched and emerged, we want to be inspecting our trees and shrubs for signs of bagworm presence, particularly little bags that are going to be about less than 1/4 of an inch in size, maybe up to 1/2 an inch if they emerged very early. And we just want to make sure that we don't see that feeding damage already occurring on our plants.
And like with so many things, what we're really trying to do is catch this early if we want to do a treatment?
Yes, the earlier we catch bagworms, the more options that we have for bagworm control. We can always start by hand-picking bagworms, and that's really effective if we have small populations of bagworms on a plant. We can drop those bagworms in a bucket of soapy water, and that's going to take care of the bagworm problem and protect our plants from feeding damage. However, if we have larger trees, especially maybe like windrows of eastern red cedar or other evergreens that we can't necessarily get to the top of or pick large numbers of bags from, we want to evaluate the presence of bagworms on those plants to determine whether or not we need to treat. If we start to see more than 15 to 20 bagworms on a plant and we can't remove those by hand picking, that's when we really need to look at the insecticide options for control to be able to prevent those plants from being damaged. A lot of our deciduous trees and shrubs can handle some bagworm damage, but especially our evergreens are going to be most susceptible from bagworm damage because they keep multiple years' worth of needles and growth on them. If we're ready to treat, we want to look at some of the insecticide options that are really organic and environmentally friendly this time of year. Typically, that could include products like Bacillus thuringiensis, or what we sometimes call BT, and spinosad is also a really effective option for control. Both of these products really need to be applied when bagworms are small, from 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch in length. And then once we start to get bagworms that are bigger than about 1/2 an inch in size, then we have to look at more traditional insecticides that may have more damaging effects on some of our beneficial insects and pollinators. So really trying to target bagworms early in their life cycle when they're small and BT and spinosad are effective is really important on trying to manage our bagworm populations.
And does this need to be a thorough application?
Yes. One of the key things about applying insecticides for bagworm control is we have to have thorough coverage of the entire plant. We want to make sure we get the top sides and bottom sides of leaves and branches, and we want to make sure that we get the foliage from the exterior of the plant all the way to the interior as well, because bagworms can be feeding in any of those locations.
And I assume that maybe additional applications may be necessary?
Yes, especially if we're using some of these BT or spinosad products, we may need to be monitoring for multiple weeks and potentially doing weekly applications of those products because they don't have a lot of residual control. What we're really trying to do is target bagworms when they're actively feeding so that when we apply these products, they're quickly consumed by the bagworm and then provide quick control of the bagworms. We'll also want to make sure that we continue to monitor for bagworms really through early to mid and even late June, because bagworms can move from plant to plant and, again, continue to hatch potentially for a few more weeks.
That's K-State Extension horticulture expert Matt McKernan with information on monitoring and treating bagworms. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.